Hi everyone, welcome to the Sip and Spin. On tonight's show, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of one of the most famous color companies in the world, play with science a little bit, and I'm going to switch it up. I'm not going to do any spinning tonight, but I am going to do some sewing. So first off, I want to talk a little bit about Pantone's Color of the Year. Pantone's an interesting company. It was originally started in 1963 when there needed to be the same vocabulary used for color in the printing industry. So Pantone assigned a number to each of the colors on the color wheel, and as they keep adding colors, they keep adding numbers. Now, in 2000, Pantone started creating the color of the year. And the color of the year is usually announced back in December. So it's taken me a little while to get going on this, but today was the perfect time to actually start talking about this. So, whenever. We're going to talk about it today. So, in 2000, Pantone started with the color of the year, and it has helped with branding. It's helped with the fashion industry. It's certainly helped the printing business. And one of the things that I've noticed over the years is a lot of cocktails start coming out right around the same time that the Pantone Color of the Year is announced. This year's color, Classic Blue, was a little bit tricky, especially when it came to making cocktails. One of the cocktails that actually has the name of the Pantone Martini is interesting because it's made with Empress 1908 gin. Empress 1908 gin has a base of pea flower. It's a blue flower, but when you add citrus to it, it changes color. Here's where the science part comes in tonight. So in my shot glass, I have straight Empress 1908 gin. When you add citrus to it, it's going to change color, and that's true universally. So depending upon what you add to this gin, it's going to change color. Well, traditionally, you mix gin with tonic water, which is a citrus base. I'm using an elderflower, and watch what happens to the blue when I add tonic. It changes from that brilliant blue to a very light rose pink, which interestingly enough, that was Pantone's Color of the Year a few years ago, I think. So that's kind of funny. So what the challenge was creating the Pantone cocktail. Luckily, Tea Leaves came out with an herbal tea that is also made with pea flower. And when you brew it, it actually brews up a brilliant teal. It's a deep, dark teal, and that's essentially what my cocktail ended up being. I wanted to keep as much citrus out of it as I could, so I used 3 ounces of Tea Leaves Pantone Classic Blue Tea, 1 ounce of Empress 1908 gin, a splash of Grapefruit Seltzer because it doesn't have the citrus in it, and then I topped it with a fun cotton candy garnish to get my Blue Skies Martini. And it's oh so dry, and it's perfectly sippable. All right, I realized that I had way too many things on the table, so I am going to take one more sip. Oh my gosh, with the cotton candy, that's just heavenly. And I'm going to set this aside, and I'll be right back. Okay, now for the meat and potatoes of today's episode, I want to talk a little about masks. There are a lot of patterns and there's a lot of information, and I am by no means an expert, but I love the science behind what goes into the construction of making something that's going to be protective. So what does it take to make personal protective equipment? And I believe that's the right acronym for PPE. You can come in and fix. I am not a scientist. I'm an English teacher. So this is just me playing. And I was working with local hospital staff. And this is what I came up with. So we're going to start with patterns. There are tons of patterns out there, and I'm going to go just kind of down the board, and you can find them if you just do a Google search. I am going to give you the link for the pattern that I feel is the most universally well-fitting in how it's designed for what it's supposed to be doing. So the first that I came across was a design, and it is basically, and I copied it, and I'm going to call this the baby hat style, because it looks a little bit like a child's baby hat, and it just fits over the nose and under the chin. Now on me, that fit perfectly, but when I made those for a couple other people, including men, it didn't work at all. It wasn't sized right, it gapped, and it wasn't comfortable. So I went to the next style, and this is a pleated style. This is an amazing mask. It was designed by a nurse, and it is hands down, when I tried it out, it was the most comfortable, and it covered other masks, so it had a dual functionality. The only downside, and absolutely this is the only downside to this mask, there are a lot of steps in putting it together. So the pattern, which you can find online, you're cutting on the fold, and it has where you put the pleats in, which is really nice, unless you don't have one of the handy cool little cutters, in which case you've got to do those all by hand. If you're doing a small quantity of these, it's great, but it's a matter of ironing in the pleats, putting in the darts, and then adding the bias tape ties. And it used the most amount of fabric, and putting on the bias tape ties required, for me, because I didn't pin it, so that was on me, I had to go back and do a lot of resewing to make sure that I caught all of the seams in the bias tape. The next one, and this is probably the most popular that you see out there, is the Duckbill Style. And this was the first Duckbill Style that I put together, and my little sister's been wearing this for quite a while. I don't like this style because I don't like the way it fits. It gaps because it doesn't gather in. Now, that could just be my error, or it's one of those things I didn't research it well enough, but it's a little bit too short in its length, which led me to the mask that I have stuck with. And I'm going to go ahead and show where I got it. This is from Tiana's Closet. And the cool thing, Tiana's Closet is run by a woman who was actually in the pattern making industry. And the two things that I really like about this is the fact that the seam allowance is already built in, and if you'll notice, it has a larger seam allowance where you're going to be putting the elastic or the ties. And the duckbill, which is what this is commonly called, has a little bit sharper angle. And it seems so silly, but this little bit sharper angle actually creates a tighter seal around the nose and mouth. And when it comes to a mask needs to do three things. It needs to stop germs from going out. It needs to stop germs and bad stuff from coming in, and it needs to form a seal around the face in some way. So then we can start talking about fibers, and this is where it's going to get fun. So first, let's talk about fabric. So woven. A woven fabric, and this is a woven fabric mask. And so it's just 2 layers of woven fabric. And you can see, that's why I didn't finish any of these, because I wanted to be able to pull them apart. So this is 2 layers of woven fabric. Here's the thing with woven fabric. A woven fabric, for those of you that weave, regardless of how tight that weave is, a woven fabric will have warp threads that go up and down and weft threads that go back and forth. That's it. they're only going to go those two directions. So even though it's incredibly tight, there's still room for very, very small particles to get through. The next type of fiber is a melt-blown fiber. Now, for those of you that felt, a melt-blown fiber is a little bit like felting. Instead of your fibers going up and down and back and forth, both vertically and horizontally, a melt-blown fiber creates a fabric where the fibers completely interlace. So they go up and down and they go at an angle and they go back and forth. So it forms a much tighter bond. And that's what the N95 masks are made from. That's what surgical fabric is made from. And that's what this is. This is Halyard H100, which is N99 surgical grade fabric. And here's what I found very interesting. This has the same feel as the interfacing that we use in sewing. And so I wanted to do some checks on that as well. I did make a mask that had fusible interfacing, and I have that somewhere in here. Yep. So this is a mask that has fusible interfacing, and it's just the two layers, and oh, it's fused, so it's kind of crunchy. The downside to the fusible interfacing, I'm going to go, I don't know, I'm not going to make any guesses. When I wore one of these, the downside to fusible interfacing, even after I washed it, was the smell. It actually made me lightheaded. So I don't know what chemical compound that they use in the glue. I was not impressed with the fusible interfacing. The other interfacing is the stuff, which for those of you that have furniture, this is basically the moisture barrier that goes behind your couch. It's Pellon melt-blown interfacing. It's 100% polypropylene. And when you look at it, this is what's so cool. It's almost identical in texture to the Halyard H100. And that's what was so, and for me, that was like, oh my gosh, you have two things in two different industries that are almost identical. And that was really, really exciting to come. It was really, really exciting to discover. Now, it'll be interesting to see how that holds up against this in the aerosol test. The other one that I have seen a lot of people talk about is felt. And sure, it's a non-woven fabric. The downside to felt, when I wore this just over my face for a couple minutes, I immediately started to sweat because it got so very, 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 very hot. One of the biggest inhibitors to a mask's effectiveness, I think, from what I understand, is moisture. So moisture acts as a sponge. And so you want to keep the mask as dry as possible for as long as possible. So I am going to grab a can of spray paint and test these out. And when I come back, I'm going to finish off the show with what I went through to make one of the masks that seems to be the most popular right now. So I wanted to come back with this amazing discovery, and basically I am covered in spray paint and I just needed to make another drink. That little experiment didn't turn out quite the way I planned. So instead of giving you this grand and wondrous discovery of what I figured out there, I'm just going to give it to you in a nutshell. So simply using a can of spray paint, which has molecules much, much bigger than the air that we breathe and what we exhale when we talk, et cetera, the molecules are huge. This is what I found out. As long as the fabric that's covering your nose and mouth stays dry, nothing was getting through. The minute that the fabric around your nose and mouth started to get wet, that's when I started to see molecules and started to see paint forming on the piece of cardboard that I had behind it to try and test all of this. The fabrics that held up the best were the pleated mask, but in terms of lining, The two linings that held up the best were the non-woven, non-fusible interfacing and the Halyard H100 or the surgical fabric. What I found probably the most interesting was the fact that the fusible interfacing, which I thought would have held up better than anything, had the same saturation rate as just the 2-ply fabric, which really surprised me. So that would be something to keep in mind as well. Also, the fusible interfacing, I could still smell the glue when I sampled the mask myself. So if you're creating masks for people that have allergies or asthma, you might want to be very conscious of the type of lining that you're putting between the front and the back layer. So I'm going to segue from that, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the sewing machine that I acquired not too very long ago. This is a hand crank machine, and one of the things that drew me to it is the fact that this machine was probably made in the early 1900s. Let's say 1918, and if you do a little bit of research, you'll know that there was another pandemic sweeping the nation in 1918, so I felt like this would be a good machine to demonstrate making masks on. This machine has a little bit of an interesting history. On it, there's a mark that says William Hutchinson, and then it has an address, 35 Tolgavel, in Beverly, England. Well, when I started to do a little bit more research on this is actually a German-made machine, and I know that it's a German machine because of the seal that it has right here. So this seal indicates that it's a German machine. It was made for the Williamson Hutchinson Company, which I discovered was a furniture company. So this little machine was used in the making of furniture somehow. I'm guessing upholstery. Based on the size of the needle, which is massive, I'm guessing that yes, it was probably predominantly used for upholstery because that needle could probably go through iron just fine. It's a hand crank machine, which I erroneously thought were only made prior to the 1900s, and that's actually not true. Hand crank machines were made well into the 1900s, as long as treadle machines. So it's kind of a new acquisition, kind of a fun acquisition, and I thought it would be kind of fun to show on the show. So let's get started making a duckbill mask with lining. So the first thing that you'll need is to find a good pattern. And like I said, the pattern that I found from Tia's Closet is the one that I found most consistently fit faces universally, and it has a couple of different tie options, which I really liked. So what you'll need to do is you'll need to cut out 2 pieces of your outside fabric. And I like doing a difference between the outside fabric and the lining just so I know what's the inside and what's the outside. Realistically, you could use the same, but what I've been doing for the inside is using fabric that is not as desirable. Yep, I absolutely cut up a sheet, and this is actually a tea towel that I had slated for another project that I'm never ever going to do. So it's now being used as the lining for this mask. So I cut 2 pieces of the outside fabric. I cut 2 pieces of the liner, put them back to back. Probably one of the biggest things that you want to make sure that your lining is on the wrong side of the fabric. And I'm going to sew this all the way down. Then for the lining, I'm going to open it up so I don't accidentally put the liner fabric on the same side and have to rip the stitch out. This I am not going to put back to back because what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew down each of these sides, and that's going to make sense in just a second. So one of the neat things with this particular machine is it does actually go backwards. And as I was getting used to using this machine, probably one of the hardest things for me was not using my foot. even though I would put the presser foot down and then I would push, and then nothing would happen. And I'm like, oh, that's right, I actually have to use the hand crank. And then to go backwards, hopefully this will work. This is one of the few machines that does this, which is so interesting. And that is not easy to turn. I actually am getting a very nice arm workout doing that. I will trim my threads. And probably the one other thing that you're going to want to do is make sure that it's kind of a nice dressmaker trick, is to very quickly clip your seams. This will make it lie just a little bit flatter in the end. So I'm just going to clip my seams, being careful not to go through that stitch. And so now I have the exterior of my mask. So that's ready to go. Now I'm going to do the same thing on these two pieces, and I will be right back once I get these two pieces done, and I will put it all together. All right, so now what I did, I sewed them and I flipped them all. So now all of my seams are open. So now this is probably one of the trickiest parts when putting these masks together. It's remembering where all of your liners are supposed to be. So in this case, I know that my right sides need to be together. And so for this one, this mask, and this is the mask that I found most effective, what I've done is I've created a pocket, and that's actually kind of a cool thing. So this mask is going to have an opening right here, and that's going to enable the wearer to put in additional filtration, whatever they would like to put in order to add another layer of protection. Again, to keep the front of the mask from getting wet. The longer you can keep it from getting wet, the more useful it's going to be. So what I'm going to do is line my seam here up with this one, line this seam up here, this one, and there's not going to be an overlap because of seam allowance. They're going to sit right on the seam together, and I'm going to put a pin in there. And this is where, as a seamstress, what we would typically do is we would open this seam up to expose it and lay it flat, and we don't want to do that this time. This time we want to make sure that this seam is pushed over so we don't have any additional ways for air or moisture or germs to get through. So we want to create as much of a seal as possible on this inside front piece. So I've put these two pieces together, and I'm going to run down and I'm going to make sure that they are lined up with my end, because that's where I'm actually going to start sewing, is down here. I'm going to put a quick pin in right there. I'm going to come up, and I'm going to go across, and then I am also going to make sure that my ends line up here quickly, and then I will come down and once again put one part here and one part right here. You can see where I'm going to have my opening. And it'll close. Once we turn it right side out, it'll be fine. Okay, so once I have everything all pinned together, and that's okay if you've got some that's hanging over, I'll probably just tuck that in as I sew and move stuff around because, like I said, this actually is probably bigger than it really needs to be. So now I am going to sit down and sew. I would recommend starting in the middle. Don't start on a corner. And the reason why I recommend not starting on a corner is because, I mean, I suppose you can. I just don't like it because starting here gives me a nice ending place. So I am going to come down and get started. Again, lock my stitch. I have to say, as I do this, not using my foot is the strangest sensation ever. I'm going to come over. And again, I've got this piece right here, so I'm just going to tuck it under a little bit. Now this is where I'm going to need to be careful because I do have an angle right here, and I want to make sure that I hit that angle. I broke a thread. So here's what's really cool about this machine. It has this great little slide compartment, and I can dig out my needle threader. This right here, I can honestly say I love the fact that my Husqvarna has an automatic needle threader, because the idea of threading a needle when you can't see is very difficult. Oh, there we go. Yay! Hopefully we can pick up where we left off. Woohoo! Look at that. I'd much rather break a thread than break a needle. Now I am going to make sure that everything is all lined up before I get going on this piece. Yes. Backstitch to lock everything in place. I just think it's cool that this can backstitch, because not many of these can. Now, before I turn it right side out, I'm going to do a couple things. I'm going to clip the corners. And clipping the corners will just give me a sharper point when I go to turn it right side out. And so now I will grab my inside, turn it right side out. And now this works pretty well in terms of points, but I do have my bamboo point turner. So if I want, ooh, and I missed it, that piece, that's going to be fine. But if you want to push out those points, that's what the turner is for. It looks like I missed some fabric there, but that's not going to matter in just a second. And I have my mask with an opening right here. It's going to tuck right in there. Now, there are lots of ways that you can handle the ties. Basically, what you will want to do is fold over and sew down this piece. Now, the one that I did for my dad, I actually took twill tape, and I extended this out to make it a little bit longer. And for this one, because I did make this mistake right here, I think that's probably what I'm going to do here as well. So I'm going to take the twill tape, extend it out, and then use whatever tie you want. You can use elastic, you can use hair ties, pretty much whatever you want, whether you want it to go behind the ear or if you want it to tie around and use longer ties to go to the back of your head. And I'll show a number of those on probably my Instagram page. The last thing that I want to show you or to talk about just a little bit is adding a nose piece. So if you want to add a nose piece, and I've done it on some of mine, and my little sister says that she likes the nose piece a lot better because it does make just a little bit more secure fit. What I've been doing is using 20 gauge floral wire because it's readily available, and this is a really, really easy step. Basically, I have been marking off roughly 2 inches. So a 2-inch piece of wire, and then I'm taking that 2-inch piece of wire. You don't want to put your nose piece in just like this because if you've got these ends on here, it's going to come right out the first time you wash it. It'll poke through the fabric. Oh, white paint. So what you'll want to do is fold this over like so, and then basically crimp it. And that's what I've been doing on both sides. So I've created a bar with the fold on it. And then on the top of my mask, I'm just going to slide it in like so. And then sew down on one side, sew down. I'll start here, I'll sew here, I'll sew across, and then I'll sew up. I am not going to do that on this machine. I'm going to run upstairs and do it on my other machine, and I'll be right back and you'll see what it looks like when I get done. And as you can see, here is the piece sewn in, and I went with the lighter thread so you could actually see, and it's hard because you don't know where the ends are. I had pins here, but I still went a little off, but that is just going to give the wearer a little bit more security around the nose. So that's basically a mask in a nutshell, and I was showcasing my new hand crank sewing machine, which doing a whole outfit on here, I'm going to have a really good right arm. I don't know what I'm going to have to do to get my left arm up to par as well. And as my sis was filming this, she pointed out that I said "so" an awful lot on this episode. So here you go. There's your drinking game for this particular episode. Every time that you hear me say "so," take a drink, because this was a little bit of a frustrating episode in that I had all of these grand expectations and it didn't quite work out quite the way that I thought, but that's okay. I ended up discovering a fun new cocktail, and hopefully you got some good information on how to create a mask if you choose to do so. As always, thank you so much for tuning in. Happy sewing.